Welcome to Monarchist Minute. I'm your host, William Stout, and happy Memorial Day, everyone. We have a fun episode planned this week with our favorite Thomas Brightsworth and Leon J. Kurlewski, and this week we're going to be talking about American imperialism. How are you gentlemen doing this fine
I'm
week?
doing just fine, thank you. It's been a while since I've been here, so I'm glad to be back. School has been kicking my butt, but nonetheless, glad to be back in the monarchism again.
Glad to have you back.
I'm
Thank you.
doing all right.
Good. So, the topic at hand is one that you brought up, Thomas. Would you like to introduce us then?
Yeah, of course. So, basically, the topic specifically, I think, centers around, of course, like you said, American imperialism, but specifically the nature of empire. We throw around that word a lot in history, in political science. Heck, we're throwing it around a lot more in theology. I study political theology, and that topic turns out is more bigger in it than I ever anticipated. And ultimately, it's becoming a bigger topic, especially with our current administration very much getting ourselves diplomatically involved in almost every important affair in the world. Um, and I think it's really important to discuss this. You have many who claim America is an empire and should embrace it. You have many who say America should kind of stick to its own soil, be more national or nation state, although even that term may not work. So ultimately, this is an important debate for American politics and including American monarchists, because that debate of should we be more isolationist is not the right word, but more national and imperial will still be here if America ever does become a monarchy. So ultimately, and I'll try to keep this as short and sweet as possible. I know I can ramble a bit. We first have to discuss what really is an empire. There are two ways we can define it. There is empire in the domestic sense and empire in the more external sense. Empire empire in the domestic sense kind of synonymous with monarchy. The idea there is one ruler who calls himself an emperor. Ultimately, he has absolute authority, maybe not absolute power. Um, it's kind of like there was an old legal idea in the medieval era, the later medieval era, that every king was an emperor in his own domain, in his own territory. But we're more so talking about empire in the external sense, which, according to Adrian Vermeule in his article "The Dominus Mundi," where he talks about this whole subject, it refers to a supranational structure of relationships between or among polities or different governments, different countries, which may themselves take various different regime types. So ultimately, and I wrote a whole paper on this specifically for the Holy Roman Empire, but it applies. In order to be an empire, you have to have a few basic criteria. So I'll try to remember them. There's the idea of you have to be a hegemon of some kind. Now, whether that's a hegemon of influence, a hegemon of military, a hegemon of diplomacy, of prestige, religion, etc., you have to be a hegemon. You have to have ruling over more than just one group of people. I think the correct term is gentes or nationes. Is Latin. So it has to be more than just your subcategory, your group of people or culture. There has to be a singular unifying figure. He doesn't have to have absolute power, but he still has to exist. He kind of has to be the face of it. And I always forget the fourth one. There's another category here I'm missing. Um, but basically that those in America obviously has all of that in her. Um, but to go over a quick misconception, because when we think of empires, our modern perception is very much of like, I don't know how many of you seen Star Wars, but the idea of the empire is just cracking down on everyone and everything, decimating cities and planets to dust. The idea of it has to be uniquely homogenizing. Everyone in the empire has to be of the same culture, the same identity, the same government form. That's very much a more modern thing. Adrian Vermeule describes it this way, where he says there are, in a way, three different supranational structures and how governments and countries sort of work together or relate to each other. The first is sort of the classical sense of empire, which is kind of how I was defining it, where it's very much it's not top down. that you have different cultures, you have different even countries, like in the Holy Roman Empire, each little thing was its own country with their own cultures, their own regimes, whether they were mini republics, city-states, duchies, theocracies, etc. And that ultimately kind of subsidiarized supranational monarchy that unifies them all. Then you have the idea of nation states. Every nation, every peoples has a right to its own state outside of any other people. So very much against nation state and very much against empires.
Hello?
We might have lost
Hello?
him for a second.
Okay, so that wasn't just me. Got it. Good. Anyway,
Sorry, did I disconnect for a minute?
yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
disconnected.
You left off at nation states.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So, yeah, you have, the concept of nation states where every nation and people has its own has a right, an obligation to form its own political polity or government or country outside of any other foreign influence or supranational influence. And at the same time as nationalism developed, you had the concept of more a classical liberal, I wanna say federal empire, although I know that term can be thrown around, where it's the idea of we are it's still an empire, but in a way, this sort of ideas of classical liberalism not ought not to be just kept in one country and nation, but that's so superior that must be spread. And this one is much more homogenizing. And this is kind of what some scholars say America is doing, that America is not a nation state. We are an empire according to the categories, or the criteria I laid out, and that we are a federal sort of classical liberal empire, and that classical liberal imperialism spreads far beyond itself to make every other country or every other people's in a way the same values, the same government form, because government forms do form out of values as us, and that we are an empire of influence, and that we do this through influence, through military, of course, but diplomacy, etc. Um, and I think that about explains it. I can, of course, answer any other objections. The funny thing is, people question are empires good or bad? You have Virgil who writes that empires, that all the people should be, of course, under Rome, that empires actually benefit all peoples and all cultures. You see this with the Gauls. Although the Gauls are a complicated case because they had a lot of their culture wiped out because they were so against Rome. But even then, if you look at the temple they were supposed to worship at, you had the statue of the emperor who they were to worship, and I think it was 50 or 60 other statues of each of the Gallic tribes, a way that Romanism did not take away from their identity. Then you have, I don't know if it's Herodotus, but it's another historian in the ancient antiquity who basically says mocks the idea of an empire or peace, etc. That the idea that empires can bring peace by saying that empires, in a way, decimate other people. They leave deserts out of once were thriving communities and call it peace, because that's ultimately why empires are the idea. Is empires are meant to unify the world, that quote unquote one world government, not in the modern sense, but in the ancient sense. And the question is that good for humanity? Is it possible for humanity? Is it even the ideal? And can it be done? And I think that about explains it. Obviously, that was a little long winded, but I think it's important to mention all that. So, yeah, I'll give it to
Well,
one of you.
I wouldn't say empires are good or bad. I would say they're inevitable. They're neutral. It's a fact of human civilization that eventually one nation will grow powerful enough to form a hegemony that the influence of said nation enforces its will upon other nations. That's just an inevitability. So we can't say whether or not empire is good or bad. We can just say that empire is a fact of life.
Right.
But
Would any of you say the same or maybe differently?
Um, like what do you mean exactly? Because you covered like a broad stroke on this.
Yeah, I kind of had
I,
to for the sake of time, but I can answer
I get
some.
that. I'm just curious on like if there's a particular like section or how we can begin to unravel all of this.
well, I don't know. Well,
I mean, yeah, no, I agree with Will. I mean, empire in itself should be seen as a neutral matter of like nature and reality. there's a lot of people,
Right.
especially
Can
like
you restart it? I disconnected for a bit and couldn't hear you.
oh yeah, no, I was just saying it was like what Will said, empire in itself should be seen neutrally. It should be seen as like a
Right.
fact of nature and reality and all that.
Right.
We don't think of water or the sky, oxygen or whatever the heck being like good or bad. It's just part of nature.
Right.
It depends on like what that empire decides to do and what it bases itself off of, maybe.
Right. But then there comes that whole debate. Now I'm kind of devil's advocating a little right
Yeah,
now,
of
where
course.
questions are empires truly a part of our nature, or are they our attempts to, in a way, um, elevate human nature? So what I mean is, for example, many that argue that the idea of nation states is probably more natural to man than to have an empire. I disagree with this, by the way, but I think it's important to bring up. You have many who say that sort of the idea of nation states, the idea of nations being self-governing, of their own culture, their own people, their own identity, religion, government, etc., is actually more natural. And that empires, in a way, are trying to. Some won't say it's like distorting human nature, but or the nature of communities. That's a way trying to elevate it into a way that doesn't exist. Um, there is that reality too. Like we talk about empires being natural, but also the idea of nations are natural. And so it comes down to that question of which one better serves human nature and ultimately humanity in of itself, nation states or empires. Because yeah, you're probably right. No one actually looks at probably empires except maybe those on the too far woke left and maybe the classical liberal right and says empires are bad in of themselves. Most people would say, yeah, they're not bad of themselves. The question is ultimately which one does help humanity? Ultimately, which one should America be?
So
I,
to begin off with that, I mean, I think one's preference for nation state is natural. That obviously
Right.
that doesn't mean preference for empire is like unnatural, but I think people want to be being like a community that they're familiar with. Again, I'm trying to use
Right.
broad statements because I'm not gonna go over like 50 different like cultures and stuff. But eventually,
Right.
what ends up happening is that a lot of the nation states, a lot of cultures, let's say, a lot of cultures want to expand, and because we live in a finite reality, but it's not limitless. They're gonna end up encroaching on others. They're gonna come into conflict, and they dominate other cultures and what have you. And I think
Right.
nature states is like that a kind of a beginning step where it doesn't automatically mean you have to go into the empire business right after you get a nation state, but like, people they like highlight they like emphasize more on nation states and stuff because they're doing it in their own self interest. Where it's like,
Right.
hey, right now we don't we have I like my culture, but it's not a strong one, not like in terms of like demographics or finances or
Right.
military strength. So it's like, let
So I
me have
think
a nation state. Let us have a nation state. Let us be over, do our own thing. And eventually, I think a lot of them do devolve into, well, not devolve, but like they do try and like go up the next step where it's like, all right, now we'll finally secure. We have the population, we have the wealth, we have the military. Now let's try and like expand ourselves a bit.
well, and actually, I'd say you're correct, and I'd agree with you in most of that. I think the only part I would disagree is, and maybe I'm just reading it wrong, the idea of conflict. Um, so a lot of it seems to be based on the idea of there's always going to be conflict, and that's in a way how empires and nations form. Obviously, there's some truth to that. Like there's a truth to conflict in human nature, but there is also the reality of humans aren't just conflict. I think like
Yeah,
conflict theory comes out of Marx. And now I'm not saying you were saying that, but that is how many view it. They view the idea of nation states in a way as constant, that all of humanity as conflict. But in the reality, it seems to be, I think you're actually correct for the most part. Now, I don't think nation states are a kind of modern thing. So I'm not gonna pretend like oh they were always a thing. Kind of like the modern idea of empire wasn't a common thing
yeah,
before the modern world. But for example, you were right that you have many nations who or peoples that do that's the nature of tribalism. That's not a bad thing. You want to be around people who are similar to you. It makes a thriving community better. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean just don't talk to anyone who's not like you. Believe me, if I was a pure tribalist, I wouldn't be getting along with Sky very well. Um, but Um,
The whole
or
podcast
many of them
wouldn't
are.
exist.
Yeah, like yeah, exactly. Like, okay, we're a large united monarchist party, but you have to be Catholic, theocratic, integralist, etc. Oh, never mind. There's only 10 people here. But but basically, there is also that weird thing of empires, like that whole idea of imperial peace. The Pax Romana, um, for example, wasn't just a declaration of, okay, everyone get along for at least a little bit. It was the idea of there will be universal peace. And okay, that's kind of a misnomer. Because like the Pax Romana meant there would be no more fighting in the empire. They still had to fight enemies on the outside. But it's the idea of everyone united under an empire can live peacefully in their own cultures, in their own quote unquote nations or gentes, in their own peoples.
I
But it
forget.
was
Was
all
the
under an
Pax
imperial.
Romana a contemporary Tom? I forget,
Um,
and I feel ashamed as a like a Roman
I I
nod.
don't think so. I know that's the whole thing with some. Let me just look at this real quick. The quote I'm getting it from specifically, um, I don't know. Actually, that one I don't know. I know it's a term that can be used. I don't think it was. I think there's the term the Pax Augusta. That might have been the older one. I don't think it's a modern one, but if it is, I'm wrong. And
The
we
Pax
do that for a
Augusta, I
lot of
could
things.
find. It makes more sense considering
Right.
like
Right.
Octavian Augustus, this whole like
Yeah, yeah.
propaganda machine. But like
Exactly.
the Pax Romana thing, like if it's what I believe it is, it's a historiographic Tom, i.e., it was like made
Oh,
after
no. Yeah,
Acts. It makes
absolutely.
sense because if you look in like Roman history after the reign after the Antonines, where everything just got worse and worse, going back to like Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, where it was like only okay, we fought maybe a 2 year wars and there was like a mini pandemic, and that was it.
Right.
Compared to we have 50 emperors in 20 years that was
Right.
we're getting invaded like every like spring.
Exactly. No, and that's the thing, Pax Romana specifically, like, that's a lot of Roman terms, like the term Romanitas, which is basically Roman identity. That's one of those terms that, like, was made over time to describe a true concept. Like, the Romans had a concept of Pax Romana, they had a concept of Romanitas, but they didn't use, like, singular, like, terms most of the time for stuff like that, so we make it as historians to better help modern people understand. But the point is the idea of the Pax Romana or the Pax Augusta was the idea of there would be no fighting in the empire, that in a way all would be united under one in peace and working together towards a common end while being able to keep their own local identities, customs. The only major exceptions originally were the Carthaginians, and that's because eventually none of the Senate really wanted them to be. Carthage was always kind of the absolute enemy that they cannot have a moment. In fact, Tertullian even mocks this idea because you had many Carthaginians much later on after the Punic Wars who were Romanizing intentionally. Tertullian, a church father, made fun of them for it in his work De Paulo or On the Paulum, which is a more philosopher garb. Then you have the Gauls, like I mentioned, and of course the Gauls constantly fighting with Rome, and a lot of their culture was wiped out. But there was also an interesting thing where, like, again, they weren't even given much of an option to worship the Roman gods, let alone theirs. They were given like imperial cult worship. But you also saw in that temple they were supposed to, the big statue of the emperor and other like 60 statues, I think 60. I always forget of like all the Gaelic tribes. So that's the thing of like imperial peace. And why is this important? Well, it seems to be that whenever a nation or a people become an empire, the mindset seems to change. Like it kind of does a 180. Instead of it being we need to just help our people, we need to help benefit our people. A lot of the mindset, or at least the outside mindset, seems to be now we got to help others. It cannot be denied that America wants to be the world's police. And of course, that benefits us to a lot of degrees. Sometimes it doesn't. A lot of the times it doesn't, but a lot of times it does. We do also believe as an American people that our way of life benefits others, that we are the greatest nation on earth, that we are the greatest, that we are an empire, and that our mindset doesn't seem to just be we have to help ourselves alone. You have many who want to do that because we've overstepped our reach. But there is that mindset of we will make the world a better place. We can make the world a more peaceful place. So I do agree with you, except I think when it comes to empire, it's not just about our benefit. I do think there's a change of mindset, at least for a large part, where it's we can make the world a better place by, in a way, putting them under us, or in the more modern empire sense, making them more like us. It can't be like, so yeah. So I think, and we see that in America. We see that with Trump. Um, Obviously, it does benefit us to kind of be the hegemon. I think it is a both ways kind of thing. The question is, are we doing it in a way that will actually benefit the world? And that's where the issue comes in. Is this modern idea, classical liberal idea of empire, actually going to benefit humanity? I don't think it will. I think the more classical one works. I don't know, but um, Will, what do you think of this?
I think empires are so. I've always been kind of a. I don't want to use the word social Darwinist because there's a negative connotation with that, but I've always been this sort. I
Sorry, I
guess
had
the
to.
word would be a organicist. I treat nations like living creatures. So I've always thought of empires as not necessarily political entities, but as the stage of when a nation is spreading in order to replicate itself. It's basically the reproductive stage of a civilization, to
Right. I
put it.
think I can agree with that. Yeah. I
So,
I I am actually like you in that regard. I believe countries, governments, peoples are organic. And that's where some people say empires are not organic, but they are sort of elevating that organic.
so basically,
If
what
that's the correct
I'm
term.
saying in that regard is the idea of making a nation a better place, the idea of an empire trying to spread these values, that isn't necessarily about making the world a better place. What that is about is basically that nation duplicating itself, its ideas, and its values. So we see
Mm.
America going all over the place, and we see America basically trying to duplicate America.
Right. I'd say though, and that's where I'd agree with you specifically that in the classical liberal concept of imperialism, that's definitely the case. That was
Well,
the case
no,
when nationalism formed, but I'd argue that that wasn't always the classical identity of empire, though. Um,
actually, no. I think actually liberalism ruined that concept of empire because liberalism started creating this whole idea of a multicultural empire where you, rather than having to rather than allowing this transformative process where the nation duplicates itself in other places and other cultures, you have this process where the nation basically isn't allowed to do that because that nation has to respect the local culture. Take Afghanistan for a reason, the US and Afghanistan. The primary reason that the US failed in Afghanistan is because we weren't allowed to disrupt those parts of the Afghani culture, those parts of the Afghani nation that were antithetical to American values and frankly antithetical to Afghanistan being a functional state because we had this idea that we had to respect the Afghan identity.
well, wait, but I'd also say that there are many cases where, I mean, to some extent, yes, I agree, but we're talking about liberalism. We're very much talking about modern class. We're talking about classical liberalism. Again, nationalism and the more modern liberal idea of empire developed in the same time in the same family. I'd
And
actually
most of
argue
them,
one reason that sort of this classical liberal idea of empires fails is that it can't break away from its truly nationalistic nature. We tried to make Afghanistan a democracy. We didn't just respect our own peoples. We did this in many countries where we actually did try to integrate our ideas and our values. The problem was also is that this form of classical liberal empire was developing around the same time of that. I would argue sort of a distorted rebirth of the classical idea that peoples are allowed their own regime types, their own cultures, etc. Because you do have that imperial conflict of empires don't have to be homogenizing. But if your idea of empire develops from a nationalistic worldview, it's kind of hard to play both at the same time. Because on one hand, it's true we did try to leave a lot of their cultures and identities intact while doing this, but there were many cases we didn't. We didn't really respect Afghanistan's ideas of freedom or concepts of it because the Eastern ideas of liberty, of belief, of religion, of politics isn't the Western one at all. They view things a lot differently than we do in mindset. We didn't respect that. We integrated our values. We try to implement democratic government, although those have always been very much um, an issue. Basically, every time we've not every time, because there have been some times where it kind of worked, but almost every single time we've tried to basically get involved in Afghanistan, we tried to establish republics or democracies. We tried to do this in others, and ultimately they failed because we really didn't. We were going into this culture, implementing our own ideas of regimes, our own ideas of ideals, of political and philosophical ideals of classical liberalism in a culture that had never known it, that had never want to known it.
And
There's a reason that
I
yeah.
actually don't disagree, but I think where we're reaching our different point is, and you're saying our problem is that we tried to force it on the Afghanis, and I'm saying our problem is we didn't try forcing it hard enough.
So you
I
believe empire should be intrinsically homogenizing?
I think empires by their nature are intrinsically homogenizing. Rome in itself was intrinsically homogenizing. Whether we like to admit it or not, everything Rome touched gradually became more Roman,
But
including the
even
barbarians
then,
that eventually conquered it.
well, if that were true, then the barbarians would have lost, at least the barbarians closer to Rome would have lost the entirety of their barbarous identity. Other than
They
Carthage and
did.
Gaul, but they still held on to many parts of that. Like in Egypt, for example, Egypt specifically, yes, it's true. Egypt, Mesopotamia, etc., were Hellenized by Alexander the Great. But not saying you're doing this, but I think we're kind of I think there's a difference between homogenization and sort of a syncretism, not in the religious sense, but in the cultural sense. So, for example, Alexander the Great Hellenized a lot of the ancient world, but he Hellenized it to where it blended with the others. Um, Egypt was allowed to be Egypt still. Mesopotamia, Judea was allowed to be Mesopotamia and Judea. Greece was allowed to be Greece. Um, it's not as if Alexander the Great said you have to be this specific category of Greek or Macedonian. Even the Roman Empire did that. Like the reason the Roman Empire constantly developed its law, specifically the Jus Gentium, the law of the nations, is because they kept taking over many peoples and they knew that just one singular Roman law would not work. That's why the Jus Gentium exists. That's why the concept has lasted so long. It's the idea of different peoples, different nations all have some moral things in common or some political things in common, but in the end are so different that it can't just be one singular law for all. There has to be a development. There also has to be distinctions in the laws between different peoples. There's the reason Roman had a patron client system. There's a reason it had the Latin ally system. There's a reason it had the method of bringing specifically Germanic tribes into citizenry. There's a reason for all of this. The only time we can say where they kind of tried to make every Roman citizen, I think, not the best example, but truly fully Roman, and in a way tried to limit sort of that process. Well, first there's the Gauls and the Carthaginians because they refused any form of Roman culture, Roman imperialism. But like Egypt, Judea even. And Judea is a complicated situation because unlike every other religion in the empire, the Jews and Christians refuse to worship the emperor. Like you have the cult of Isis, you have the cult of Mithras, you have many others.
I
You have
I
the
don't
only
mean to
and
interrupt. I don't mean to be rude, but
yeah,
I'm confused of where exactly you're trying to go with the Roman history lesson.
my bad. I'm basically trying to argue that empires are not in of themselves homogenizing. They can blend their cultures and customs
Okay,
and values in others, and it's possible, but that's different than homogenization because in the end,
so
Rome, most of it didn't try to make everyone exactly the same type of Roman as the ones in Rome. Most classical empires did not.
So,
They blended the values and
yeah,
cultures.
so
We,
of
yeah,
course,
I want to
there's
say this against.
hybridization.
I want to say
Um,
this like a while ago. I disagree with Williams whole like I guess analysis or perspective of like the quote unquote classical liberal empires trying to like be having some kind of fundamental break and being multicultural because you see the Romans and the Persian empires and even the Assyrians. I mean, we're talking super ancient empires here. I mean, there was no way, no attempt, let alone a will, for them to try and homogenize them all. Everywhere from like Britain to Egypt to like Afghanistan, all of the whole like ancient world. We're all gonna just speak like Assyrian now, or we're all just gonna speak like Persian
it's
or
true.
Babylonian or something. This idea that it's a multicultural empires and like is because of like the Enlightenment or whatever. That's not that's just a misreading of history.
Wait,
No,
are you
no,
talking
wait a
to
minute,
me
wait a minute,
or
wait a
no?
minute, because I think we're really, really,
Oh
really
wait a minute,
I think we're really, really overstating just how multicultural these nations are. First of all, Rome was very, very, very much a what's the word I'm looking for? Not ethno state, but it was very much a Roman centric state. Like, yeah,
it was a centralized empire. Yes, it
there
was. Yes,
were
they built the
non-Roman.
roads and they made you speak Latin so that
Right.
when they came time to collect taxes, they could just say, "Oh, by the way, you owe like 10 talents of silver." I don't know the currencies, but so
No,
it's
no, no,
not
no,
like
no,
we
no.
have to
Rocky.
convert it 8 different times. Yes, I admit that. Especially and the Romans were the most centralizing of all of the ancient empires, much more than the Hellenistic and Persian and the
Right.
Mesopotamian empires. Yes,
Now,
but like
yeah,
they still
there's a very big difference between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, where the Persian Empire was basically just a tribute system, and every satrap was basically a sovereign state that just owed fealty to the Persian Empire,
there's
whereas the
another.
Roman Empire actually had a system of assimilation,
Well,
integration, and
Well,
what
I
was
think I
that?
think there's
Romanization.
another issue here that we've not a fundamental kind of like thing we didn't address first is that because because it is part of human nature and there's so many facets to it or different ways. You have like the internal plus external empire kind of like us variable factor. I can't think of the exact one, but like, and the Soviet Union's a good example because you
Like
have like
direct
in
control
the
versus
no
sphere of influence.
let me say it let me go through it because I was respectful and listened to all of you guys without interrupted. You have the internal versus the external, where it's like you have within the empire within the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's empire outside of its own like its former borders. But there's another kind of like um a variable or different facet to look at it. And it's like the empire of one versus the empire of a nation. Where you have like an emperor at the head of his own country versus a nation, a culture trying to dominate others. Which and it's much more complicated in that one versus like the internal external example. So like yes, the Roman Empire was a much more centralized empire than Alexander's or the Persians or whatever. But but the Roman Empire, like those other empires, was still centralized. They were still focused on like one man or like one house. It was not the Roman nation. Like it's somehow like the Roman Italians superior,
Oh,
like perpetually superior to everyone else because eventually the Italians were seen as like backwards, and it's like oh
right.
the Romans in like Spain and Gaul and Greece and Syria, those superior Romans at
Well,
some
and
point.
also the Roman concept of being Roman wasn't really even built on race or even nation. Rome
It
was
was
unique in that a
citizenship
lot
of a
of its
city.
citizenship, exactly. And that's kind of the entire concept of the ancient world. You really weren't no Italian called themselves Italian. They described themselves based on their locality. And this is where I love the Holy Roman Empire as a great example. Now, again, I know we have different opinions on it. The reality is, you did have this idea of there was one emperor. There was groups of very powerful electors. You had the free city-states, you had the bishoprics, you had the duchies, etc. All these different government regime types, these different local peoples and cultures under this one concept. And also specifically, I'm looking at the Aeneid here, because the Aeneid was meant to be like this is the identity of Rome and like an entire book. I can't find the exact quote, but basically, Virgil goes on specifically to talk about the different missions of the different states. For Carthage, it's represented by Queen Dido, and it talks about civil trading, and that's its mission, etc. It's shipbuilding. The different Etruscans, Italians, the idea of these different there's a few different things, but basically goes on. This is the mission of the Greeks. This is the mission of the Carthaginians. This is the mission of the tribes. But Rome, you will rule through law. That Rome was in a way that's predestined. That's such a bad term to use, but I'm just
Right, right,
using
right.
it for now. For this
Well,
specifically, to rule all of them. But the fact is, nowhere in the Aeneid or nowhere in other Roman literature I can find, which again is meant to be their ideals, what they're trying to follow, what made Roman into a book. Aeneas, the writer, Virgil, never states that your job is to make them Roman. In fact, he clearly distinguishes all of them in their different missions, but ultimately that Rome shall rule them all. And that really is the classical concept of empire. And that ultimately, there are many things that led to the fall of Rome. There are many things that led to the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. The idea of allowing these people, their local customs and identities really wasn't it. The problem with a lot of them was of course, there's the issue of centralization, specifically the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs refused to develop where develop was needed. Rome, it was much more complicated. There's the whole thing of civil wars. There's the whole thing of taxes, economy. There was a whole thing of having more
Rome
barbarian soldiers than Roman soldiers. There's a lot.
Rome
Point
basically
being,
ate itself.
Rome, yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Um,
And
the decay of empires a lot of times happen on the inside. But point being is the classical concept, they didn't have this sort of classical idea of homogenizing. They had an idea of not even assimilating, of blending, of synchronizing. Because if they really tried to assimilate,
now,
they did a pretty bad job.
well,
Because the reality is they let there be multiple cults. The government recognized multiple cults, recognized different peoples and their distinct missions, even gave the Gauls their own statues, which for them meant a lot more than just, oh, we look based, to keep their identity around the emperor. So ultimately, I think now I agree with you. Like, obviously, there should be a blending of identities, especially in an empire. I don't
now,
think people under America should consider themselves more Hispanic or German than
no,
American. I think that
okay,
imperial
then
identity comes
we're
first.
actually then we're actually on the same page.
But
But
I
I
do,
think where
yeah.
we're messing, where we're not diverging, is you see the mixing as something different than assimilation, where I see the mixing and the hybridization and the synchronization as a process of assimilation. It's not distinctive from the assimilative process. It's part of the assimilative
No, I
process.
agree with you with that, and I know you believe that the blending and synchronizing is not a bad thing, and that's. But do we believe that that blending and harmonizing of different identities and regimes, etc., has its end goal in being absolute assimilation? Or do we believe that it has its end goal in being this harmonized, subsidiarized structure? Like, because I
I
see
believe
nothing.
that the two
Yeah.
are indistinguishable.
Wait, say it again. Sorry.
I believe those two things are indistinguishable. As
So,
complete assimilation and complete harmonization, there is no distinction between complete assimilation and complete
I mean,
harmonization.
not entirely. Like in the Christ, and this is a weird example, but in the Christian idea of politics, the church and the state must work together in harmony. In fact, they didn't even use the term church and state. They used laity and clergy. Like the idea of laity ran the governments and the politics, while the clergy ran the religious. Although the laity would submit to the clergy in matters of religion and even morality and politics. It was the idea of harmony. And Greek Orthodox, they call it symphonia, and Roman Catholicism, we call it the two swords. There was a distinguisher, and they were two separate things, but they worked in harmony, one under the other. Pope St. Gelasius writes to the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius on the idea of he basically clarifies the empire is its own thing. The emperor's, oh, thank you, Toby, and the two kingdoms in Lutheranism. Um, absolutely. So, like the idea of they do work in harmony, and there is a blending. Both the church, quote unquote, both the clergy or both the church and the state are in one body of Christ. But there are clear distinguishers that even if they work in harmony, even if they blend in their identities, like the state being fully Catholic and Christian, the church being somewhat hierarchical and political, they are still distinguished. The state, at least for us, never should fully become the church herself. We don't believe in the idea of for a lack of better words, a god emperor. That because we also don't believe the Pope himself should be in a way. I mean, there's the hierocratic theory, but then that goes back to the idea of subsidiarity. We also don't believe that the Pope should be king of America if America ever became Catholic. They're distinguished, but they're harmonized. They're blend.
They're
If I were
distinguished.
to take but they are distinct. In fact, they still keep their distinguishing marks. Um, but if they were to be assimilated, then the state would be, in effect, fully, and I'm using modern terms, the church. There would be no difference between the president of the United States and basically a bishop of the United and the primate of crud. I always forget which one is America, specifically the primate, basically the Archbishop of Baltimore. It would be one and the same. Whereas in This view, the two swords one, there's a harmonization, there's a blending of identity, but they are clearly distinguished and they do not try to, in a way, over assimilate. And that's where I'm trying to get at. I think there is a distinguisher between sharing values, sharing some customs, versus being completely one and the same.
So I'll also
I
say this. Oh, go on.
Leon,
I'm
you say,
more of the
actually,
mindset of just because something is distinct doesn't mean that it's assimilated. This is very much a mindset coming from me as an engineer where different parts of an industrial process might be distinct, but they're all part of the same process, the same system, and therefore, why they are distinct, they are assimilated. They are unified in one whole unit. So even though there is a distinction, there is no ultimate, what's the word I'm looking for?
right.
Basically, what I'm saying is departmentalization should not be mistaken for distinction. Just because
Oh,
something
yeah.
is
I'll address that in a minute.
broken.
I do, because I have a response to that, but I want to hear what Leon has to say first, if that's okay.
I'm taking it out of this because I wanted to say more before, and I just stayed quiet. I
My
sat
apologies,
back.
man. I didn't
No,
realize.
it's good. It's good. Neither of you have to apologize. It's just how
Yeah.
I am. But why we failed in Afghanistan was because we tried to. The United States, and I'll say this constantly, even though we came first, was so interrelated to the Soviet Union. It's like we're Rome and the Carthage, or however whatever comparison you want to make.
I love
Like
that analogy.
we're like yin and yang, unfortunately, whether we like it or not. And part of being part of yin and yang is the fact that we're both two ideological empires. It's not empire based off race or I don't know whatever other like way you want to define it is. It's based off of you have to believe in like X, Y, and Z.
Right.
So you have to
It's an
believe in.
empire of, it's an identity of values rather than an identity of race or tribe.
Yeah,
Yes.
values. But so like what we ended up doing in Afghanistan, same with what the Soviet Union did in tried to do in Afghanistan and Eastern Europe. It's just we're gonna like you have to believe in like Marx is the new prophet, or I guess George Bush would be like the second coming or whatever. I'm being sarcastic with that, but
Yeah.
it was more so have this government say that X, Y, and Z values are the greatest and everyone else should follow them, and you know and then pay up to us a little bit, and then that's it. That's all we wanted. So we go in, we invade, we give them a democratic republic, and then we tell them go just walk with it, and then obviously give us some kickbacks and stuff. And sure, we did a lot of other things, a lot like female education and stuff, but it was a secondary concern, secondary to the idea of making sure that the democracy in Afghanistan works. Because if it doesn't, then it means democracy is a false god, and we can't have that as Americans. Oh, we can't have
And
this as the Bush/Obama administrations.
I think
oh,
the
exactly. And
problem.
that's where I love the Holy Roman Empire. That's where I love other like ancient empires is, and that's ultimately the reason like a lot of modern classical liberal ideas of empires fail is we obviously I think we all agree that there's some there is the issue of assimilation. Obviously, I don't think assimilation's ultimately the best idea. But there is interesting how in many of the classical empires they left the other forms of government regimes intact. Like whether it's the Holy Roman Empire and just diplomatically having some, whether it's Rome and allowing local city states to kind of keep their type of government structures, local city like government structures, whether it's sort of Alexander the Great who allowed the different generals to
Yeah,
choose
yeah,
their own
yeah. I mean,
government
you can
structures
make
and
making
make them strict.
examples, but we get it though, because like I'm not trying to be rude, but you can list all the ancient examples, and we would agree because
Right, my bad.
you're smart, you know which ones to use. But it's like
Oh, I'm not
part
saying
of
it because
that
I'm
part
saying
of
I'm
that
smart. I'm
fact.
saying it because I'm passionate. But yeah,
No,
true.
no, I
I
get
know
it.
what
I
you
get it. Sorry, I know you guys want to keep a time schedule and stuff,
no,
and
all good.
we honestly we've not barely scratched the surface on what
Right.
the focus was. But I want to say, again, it was better for the Romans and the Persians than Alexander, because it was like it was the empire was more centralized on the emperor, not on like the form. It's not like this massive structure of like laws and bureaucracy and like national hierarchy and stuff. It was pay your dues to the emperor, and then everything else is fine. Now with America and the Soviet Union, it's not just you have to give us money. Please do not, please comply. It's like, oh, we also need you to do all these other things. We need you to change your language. We need you to change your belief in God. We need you to change, your treatment of women. Again, etc., etc.
And ultimately,
I
that's
would
where it comes down to. Sorry, I'll let you go. Will.
Well, I'm just because Leon mentioned something about bureaucracy, I just have to say I would say that the bureaucracy does create a bit of redundancy because in the case of Rome, you got a bad emperor, everything kind of blows up. But as the joke with back in Biden was president, said Biden was incapable, but the American Empire and the bureaucracy, the American Empire was so well kept that even though we basically had a geriatric corpse in the White House, the empire marched on for 4 years.
Right.
Sure,
The
I can
idea
admit
that
to
an
that.
empire is bigger than its emperor. I'll say very
Because
quickly two
the
things.
American Empire didn't have we don't have an emperor. Therefore,
Well, I'm
we've
using
not
empire.
transitioned to that type.
Right. Well, I'm saying the reason I call it emperor, I am using it in the second of the idea of sort of external sense. You are correct. We're not an empire or emperor in a domestic sense. Um, So, yeah, I fully agree with you. The reason I say emperors, I always try to use that in the secondary external sense because I do think the president is an emperor, but I don't think he'd call himself that because I think he's only in the external sense. Now, if we became an empire in the domestic sense, then yes. Um, that was important for me to clarify. So thank you for that. But very quickly, two things specific. I forgot what I was going to say to Leon specifically. Um, but the compartmentalization stuff. So like the idea of distinguishing but still assimilated. I'd argue, well, that we actually agree on that a lot more than you may think. So like for example, in the example I gave, Virgil definitely saw the different peoples under Rome as striving towards one mission. They had to share some similar ideals. Absolutely, you can't run an empire with everyone having being exactly the opposite. But for Virgil, when he talked about the distinguishings of Carthage, of Greece, of Persians, of Gauls, etc., and of Romans, he very much saw them as all working together in this one goal. I mean, I have to find in the Aeneid. I kind of wish I brought it with me. I had it in my room, but they were all working as to use engineering terms, a machine towards one end, at least in the mind of the high ideal Romans during the time of the Pax Augusta. Um, but and this is where I'd agree with you also that yes, there has to be some sort of similarities in ideals and values. The question is, are they good values, of course? And the question is, how do you integrate it? So, for example,
Right,
many
but
cultures and customs were allowed to keep their pagan gods. Gaul wasn't. And that's the issue with Judea and Rome, Judea, specifically the Christians and the Jews, is that unlike every other group in the empire who was at least willing for a time to worship the emperor or to worship the pagan gods, the Jews and the Christians never were. The Jews were given some exceptions because they were there that long. Their culture was very much different in that they were very hyper I don't want to say hyper monotheistic. I am a monotheist. I'm a Catholic, but monotheistic. And for a while, the Romans respected it, and ultimately they didn't. At the end of the day, Christians, it became much more complicated because now Roman citizens who were obligated to worship the emperor weren't. So I fully and Rome saw that as necessary to be Roman. It's like if a Roman stopped paying taxes. So, like for example, if my idea of empire were to come true, yeah, I'd want every government to be Catholic. I'd want there to be a recognition of at least that Jesus Christ is Lord and God. Um, but the question is, how far does that sort of blending go? I think that you can have like, let's say, for the fun of it, we annexed Canada and Mexico. There are a lot I think they should take from us in identity and culture. There's a lot that they shouldn't. There's a lot that they should keep, and we should allow them to keep. They would still be good mechanisms, quote unquote, of the regime, even if they don't fully assimilate. And I agree with you on the organic part. Countries do organically develop, empires do as well. I don't think that organic development automatically means they're becoming more and more American in every single aspect. And I'd
well,
say
no,
that was the case for the ancient world. I'd say that'd be the better case for now, and that if America didn't try to constantly do regime change, if America was smarter at what she did and actually allowing them to keep their own regimes, their own structures, while trying to assimilate some core values to be American, I think a lot of this would have gone a lot better. But I also think trying to annex the Middle East just doesn't work either, to be honest.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say
I'm not
this
for
when it comes to like
annexing the Middle East either.
when it
That's
comes to imperial foreign policy, America's a selfish hole, an ignorant, selfish hole. I'm just gonna say it. I know, close, sorry if it offends your ears, but like, our foreign policy is so based out of the doing whatever the highest bidder says and stuff. And I know that's an easy criticism. I know I'm not original in that, but like, I should have said this before how before we had even started at the beginning of the episode. But like another axis, and axis is the one I was thinking of when I was talking about internal versus external, in the focusing on an individual and a family versus a nation as for empire. Another axis is the empire either as an empire of civilization or an empire just of this one group. Again, uh, I think America has this issue where it still doesn't even know its own identity, let alone how empire works into that.
I think the
Right.
problem
And
with
I
America as an empire is since we have an elective system of government, our foreign policy and the entire basis of how we conduct that empire changes very quickly, very rapidly. So it's not necessarily that we don't necessarily have an identity. It's just that we have no direction. The direction is
Right.
constantly changing.
Oh
And
yeah,
this
that's
is
another
why.
issue. That's another issue. But like as an empire of civilization, that's why we have this like I guess I'll say suicidal tendency to try and be a bleeding heart and be like, oh, we have to go into Afghanistan or Iran or whatever and try and fix the issue. But then it's like, I mean, we'll stay there because it's like we didn't go balls to the wall with the military operation to completely exterminate the enemy and thus financial gain, but we don't want them to become part of us because we don't want the Afghans and Iranians to have American citizenship and be part of like our elections.
Right.
We can't make this like decision where it's like how are we gonna like we we just can't make these like actual hard decisions because you're gonna
Right.
end up offending people, you're gonna offend influential groups, and therefore we try and compromise and we end up
Right.
being holded out by these groups.
I
Well,
think the other
Trophy.
problem is, and this has more to do with decadence than it has to do with policy, is that the American people, we as a people, don't have the willpower to really commit to it because as soon as
Oh yeah,
something
because we don't have a
requires enough,
militaristic culture.
yeah,
Well,
as soon as something requires enough effort and as soon as it requires us to get out of our comfort zone, we flake out.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I'd say a few things real quick. So first, Leon, I'd say yes, I absolutely agree. A lot of our diplomatic foreign policy is very much based on a highest bidder. But I'd also say you gave actually the example of America having a bleeding heart. That is majoritively the citizenry. Like no, like it's that running joke of like that of the soy jack crying like, "Why are you making me go and fight for the military industrial complex?" And the president's like, "Oh, of course not. We're fighting for freedom." It's the reality of that idea of imperial peace hasn't gone away. The idea of the hegemon has in a way a moral duty to make the entire world a better place by imperial influence. So even then, when I'd say I fully agree with you, especially those in power are doing it based on money, that concept of imperial peace, of making the world better because we are the hegemon, we have a moral duty to, hasn't left. And also, I'd say specifically to Will, I'm trying to remember specifically the exact I forgot what I was actually going to say. Um, I can't remember exactly. What was the last thing you said, Skylar, before I started talking?
I can't remember. There's
Darn it.
been so
Oh,
much mentioned
oh, well,
already.
wait, I remember now. Sorry, but basically the idea of like we are a federal constitutional republic with democratic values, and that very much does have an effect on our foreign policy. And that's why the whole debate of empire versus nation state is a concept in America. You don't know which one we ought to be because Leon's right. On one hand, if we do become an empire that has a whole lot of things with it, including making a lot of the territories we take over citizens, um, then there's also the other part. If we stay a nation, we seem to be a nation with imperial tendencies, and that ultimately makes everyone's life a little harder. But also, I would say, while republican empires are a concept, I mean, the Roman Republic was an empire long before it claimed to have an emperor. There is really a thing historically where empires that aren't empires in the domestic sense, but only in the external sense, do naturally become empires in the domestic sense because they need to centralize. Because we realize that democracies can be possibly pretty good at the smaller level, but ultimately bigger and bigger it gets much harder. Like democracies are actually relatively good at the local city level,
Right.
state level, but the moment
I
they
don't
become
think
bigger and
anyone
bigger,
I don't think anyone here would disagree with that, and that's why most historical examples of democracies were small nations or city
I mean,
states.
I would kind
exactly.
of disagree, but I don't want to get into that tangent right now. I mean,
Yeah,
unless you
that's
guys want
another
to.
tangent for another day. But point
I
being
mean,
is
yeah.
we've stretched so far that seems we are centralizing more and more until we take empire in the domestic sense. That seemed to be the case for many empires. But point being is I fully agree. We really shouldn't try to be doing that until we discover what actually America ought to be.
America, and I've said this before, America, the problem with America and what America is facing right now is America became a superpower too early in its history. We were way too young of a nation to have grown as big as we did, as fast as we did.
I mean, yeah, but you could say the same thing about many. Like, I actually took a class in the Roman Empire and Republic recently, and the way Rome developed and expanded is actually
Oh yeah,
pretty unique.
it did it too fast too. I'll say
It did
that.
it way too fast, and ultimately that's where Augustus comes in. But it really was impressive, and there's a reason many compare America to the Roman Empire. But that's also an episode for another day.
Yeah.
But the
Oh yeah.
reality is, Roman Empire did expand too fast, but they won by becoming they survived by becoming an empire in the domestic sense, a monarchical sense. Um, of course, they would never take on the title of kings, but Imperator became, in a way, that monarchical figure because Augustus was a monarch. The question is that the way we want to go? Now, all of us would be like, yes, because empires are monarchies in the domestic sense. The question is, you got to get the American people to believe it. And I think Americans are believing it more and more, whether they believe in a strong executive, whether they believe in monarchy, etc. We're seeing that the federal Democratic Republican system doesn't work. And for that, I think our imperial nature, our imperial sort of mindset as America, if it weren't for that, I think less people would be more inclined, I think more people would be less inclined to monarchy than they already are.
So I'm just gonna give my point of view. I might even have to change my own views on this because I've always prided myself on being on a few things. One of them, my first one, is being an individual, being myself, than being a carbon copy clone of anyone else. The second one, which I might have to change in order to be like at least consistent in my like look on life and everything, is being a member of civilization, not a civilization, not American civilization, no civilization, full stop. And I think part that is like an issue we have to like get over. Me and whoever else, I don't know. I'm just talking, trying to get my ideas out. But I think for America, what my ideal would be I think almost unprecedented. I'm not sure on that. I mean, of course, anyone's allowed to fact check me. I don't have all the knowledge of history in the world, but I think we should be an empire domestically and internally. And I think if those two, the synonyms, but there are differences with how you and I have been using them, right, Wolf, internally and in domestic. But as
Right.
in terms of externally, we have to stop trying to be an empire of civilization, an ideological empire. We have to be an empire first and foremost in our own like interests. Which I
Agreed.
mean, you can make the argument, oh well, what's the difference? This sounds like semantics. No, there's major differences. And
No, there
part of
are.
that, instead of being an empire of civilization, where it's like we have to go into Afghanistan to give them democracy, we need to go into Nigeria to protect, this religious group against that religious group. No, no, we all, an empire in our own interests. Needs to be we're gonna invade Cuba because it's like Cuba's right next door to us and they hold Russian and Chinese spies. Now I'm not actually saying we should invade and bomb Havana, but I'm saying that should be more of the focus than we're gonna try and like blockade and missile strike Iran and the other side of the world, which we're never gonna actually like take over or whatever.
Oh,
You know,
don't get.
We can talk
Don't
about
keep.
that later if you want to, but I'm just saying, focus closer
I
to the
know.
homeland.
I know.
Focus
I'm
closer
just
to the
saying.
homeland. Do
I'm
not
not.
focus on the other side of the world. I'm moving on so that we don't focus on Iran, even though I brought
I.
it up. And
I
it,
know.
I
I know. I'm not disagreeing with you. I actually agree with you entirely, Leon, on that aspect. The civilizing mission and its consequences has been a disaster for geopolitics, and this whole idea of foreign policy resting on sanctimony frankly annoys me. But I'm
oh
just saying
I understand that too.
the reason I'm just saying, oh, don't get me started on Iran is because the whole fiasco with Iran's got me so incredibly pissed. And it's like, if I get on this rant, we're going to be here all
Okay,
night.
so again, we can turn back to that later, maybe. I mean, I at least want to finish what I want to say. And again, I think it's unprecedented because it's usually, well, it's like internally, domestically, we have an emperor, internally, well, nation state, externally, we're gonna do whatever we damn well please because it doesn't matter. Because either if you do the empire in for self-interest or the empire for civilization, they both bring benefits back to the homeland. And so again, that's why I think my view is very unprecedented in history. I and this goes back to my own view. It's like I don't yeah, does tribalism in this country. I think that's very obvious, especially in the past few years and stuff. But it's like at the end of the day, whether you're black or white, rich or poor, whatever kind of conflict you want to make, we're all Americans, except for that small group that says, we're not actually Americans. Well, because we pride this over whatever, and it's like, screw you guys. It's either join us or get out. But that's separate. But it's like again, I see America as being like multicultural is fine, or like being diverse is fine. Again, I'm using that in a broad sense. That some people might say I'm too woke. I would heavily oppose that, but that's how I view it. I don't want I don't want an ethno state or whatever, and I don't judge people based off of these traits. I think that's fine. We're all Americans. We should all accept that. And we should all embrace that with pride and dignity. When it comes to dealing with the rest of the world, again, we should be protecting ourselves, not protecting. I'm sorry. What is it? We prioritizing ourselves over others. So it's like I don't give a crap if it's like if you're gonna make the argument, well, because we're the same race or the same religion, you should actually trust me, this foreigner on the other side of the country, more than the people in your own neighborhood and stuff. I'd say it's that is like we gotta get rid of that. It doesn't matter if you're a white American or black American or whatever. We're all Americans, and it's us against the outside world. I don't care if it's like a German Protestant or an Arab Muslim or whoever the hell. They are not Americans. They are outside of America. They do not believe in the American community. So that's my ideal way of how we should look at things. It's not going to happen. I know that's not going to happen, but that's my ideal. And of course, we should have an emperor to lead us for the sake of easier decision making.
I pretty much said all I've needed to say. So, yeah.
I mean, I've I think we've said enough. Do we have any closing remarks, or are we ready to wrap this up?
I guess the last remark, I want to say happy Pentecost to all Christians out there who celebrate today. Interestingly enough, I was thinking about it at Mass. We use in ancient, like in some Catholic terms, including from the early church, that the idea that the church is in a way an empire that expands beyond all borders and nations and peoples. Pope Pius XI talks about this. It's funny how on this day, in a way, that empire of Christianity, the church was created, and ultimately, of course, not for this world but the next, to bring souls to heaven. The idea of it's constantly expanding, constantly. I think I'm quoting Saint Jerome here. Instead of conquering cities, like actual cities, and taking home as prizes loot, prisoners, gold, slaves, etc., we are conquering the city of man, or the hearts of men, and taking their souls home as prizes before God. And I just think it's kind of coincidental that we're doing this topic on this day. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. But ultimately, yeah, happy Pentecost. Happy Memorial Day too.
All right, without further ado, please bow your head and join me in the closing prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this week on Monarchist Minute. We hope to see you next time we have an episode, whenever we're available. We've been pretty busy as of late, hence why this is the first episode in a while. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit like, comment, and subscribe. If you're listening to this on a streaming service like Spotify, Substack, whatever, just hit whatever the button is that gives you the notification, or sign up to get the notifications. Find us on social media, visit our website, send us an email or a DM if you want to get involved in the cause, or you can just join us on Discord as well. Until next time, may God bless you, may God bless the United States of America. We hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day. Thank you, and good night.